Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Right now, as you sit there listening to this podcast, is this real? Is what we are experiencing real? What does that mean? Or could it be possible that we exist within a simulation? Obviously, we are experiencing something right now. So the question is, what is reality? Could everything we see, everything we experience, everything that exists in our entire universe be a part of some sort of simulation that is not real but artificial? Supporters of simulation theory believe that not only is it possible that we're living in a simulation, it's likely. And the more we look for evidence, the more we find that we are in a simulation. So let's discuss this. The idea of the universe being a simulation is not a new one. Theories exist in ancient cultures around the world. Modern simulation theory comes from Nick Bostrom, a philosopher from Oxford, who wrote an influential paper on the subject back in 2003. Now, assuming that living in a simulation is possible, Bostrom presents the simulation trilemma, which says one of the following has to be true. 1, we destroy ourselves before we're able to create a simulation. 2, we are able to create a simulation but choose not to. Or 3, we are definitely in a simulation. Bostrom believes each of these is likely to be true. That's not controversial. We use computer models all the time to study human population, predict the weather. For entertainment, we simulate everything. When a civilization can create a realistic simulation, the most obvious one to create is that of its own early existence, which Bostrom calls the ancestral simulation. A civilization that can do this wouldn't just create one simulation, but they would create many. Ancestor simulations, as proposed by Bostrom, believes that in the future it will be possible to stimulate the actions of all the neurons in the brain and simulate the sensory input to that brain with enough accuracy to convince the simulation that it is a real person. For it to happen at such a scale as our universe would seem impossible. But Bostrom made some calculations that show that a super advanced civilization could do this, on such a scale that these virtual minds tremendously outnumbered real minds. There are many articles, videos, and interviews on the topic, and even people like Neil deGrasse Tyson have backed up this belief. An advanced civilization might want to run such a simulation for science, so it can understand its own history, to study the behavior of the types of minds that lived in the past. How would this all be possible? According to experts on the matter, this civilization would need a computer that's the size of a large planet. Bostrom's biggest argument for this belief is called the simulation argument, which he states that if ancestor simulations are something an advanced civilization would end up creating, then most of the self-aware minds that ever come into existence are simulated ones. Another argument for this belief is the idea of the Boltzmann brain, which argues that in an infinite multiverse, it should be tremendously more common for particles to randomly assemble into a brain that is having the exact same experience as you are having right now, than for particles to create a Big Bang. Ancestor simulation is a belief proposed by Bostrom, and he believes that in the future it will be possible to simulate the actions of all the neurons in the brain and simulate the sensory input to that brain with enough accuracy to convince the simulation that it is a real person. For it to happen at such a scale as our universe would appear to be impossible. But Bostrom made some calculations that show that a super advanced civilization could do this on such a scale that these virtual minds tremendously outnumber real minds, there are many articles and videos and interviews on the topic. Another argument for this includes the Copernican principle and the anthropic principle, which loosely states that we aren't in a special place of the universe. We are in a typical galaxy, with one exception. Our place in the universe must be able to produce and sustain life. So if the virtual minds of an ancestor simulation are vastly more common than the original living minds that created the simulation, and if the simulated experience is completely consistent with our own experience, then it is more likely that we are those typical observers, statistically speaking. Bostrom states that the chances that we are a simulation is less than 50%, like around 40%. This is due to the fact that a civilization is just as likely to die out before they have a chance to create such advancements, or an advanced civilization would just as likely choose to not make these types of simulations. Also, there are no experiments that can be done to disprove this belief, making it unfalsifiable, which is a huge red flag. This belief is really only popular for a few scientists and people who are interested in such extraordinary beliefs due to the fact that this belief goes against the vast majority of religions, and there's no evidence of this belief. It is not popular due to the fact most, if not all, people want a meaning in life, and being a simulation would make that seem unimportant. A lot of advancements in science would have to occur in order for ancestor simulations to be created. But according to scientists, we will be able to create such simulations on a way smaller scale in 1 or 2 generations. The fact we all could just be a simulation in a planet-sized computer might cause a lot of existential angst. But the idea that we could also be the people that come up with such advancements should be more uplifting. There are a lot of unknowns in this world, and there are many answers in life that we will never obtain. And I don't want to nullify the fact that everything you do as an individual is meaningful, as anyone else who has ever lived on this planet. So at some point, you start to ponder that simulated civilizations will start to create their own simulations of the universe, and on, like a Russian nesting doll of reality. As deGrasse Tyson says, we would have simulations all the way down. Now, I don't necessarily cite him as somebody that holds extra knowledge in any way, but when Elon Musk was asked if this is our base reality, he said there's a 1 in a billion chance that we're in our base reality now. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a little more conservative. He thinks the odds that we're in a base reality versus a simulated reality is 50%. That's a pretty high percentage. We mostly hear what scientists think about this. It's not scientific theory. Simulation theory isn't math. It's philosophy. It isn't physics. It's metaphysics. So what we need is hard evidence that we live in a simulation. And to find proof, all you have to do is look at the universe around you. Let's start at the beginning. There was no space or time. The contents of the entire universe were concentrated to the size of a tennis ball and had the temperature of a quadrillion degrees. And then suddenly, the Big Bang, everything explodes outwards. At the speed of light, 14 billion years later, we've got galaxies and planets, everything you can imagine. If before the Big Bang there was no space and no time, what was there? What about the beginning of the universe from the religious point of view? God created everything. That's fine. Where was he before what caused the Big Bang to happen in the first place? What made God decide to snap his fingers and make this happen? And if you ask a physicist to explain what existed before the universe, they'll give you weird energies like quantum foam, dark energy. Ask a theologian and what happened before then, and it becomes even more confusing. What does make sense is the universe was just sitting there, dormant, when someone somewhere decided to boot up a program. And in that program, all the laws of the universe are set into code. Gravity, electromagnetism, and gravitational force are written into the program. The speed of light gets a value. There's code for Planck's constant of mass, speed, and time. All those different mathematical constants and numbers are there that determine the behavior of everything that exists. All part of our program. Even consciousness itself is part of our simulation. If you've never heard of simulation theory, then this might sound far-fetched, but some of the world's most respected scientists, technologists, and philosophers believe that it is more likely than not that we are living in an artificial reality. So, how do we prove it? What is real? How do you define it? If we live in a simulated reality, it would make sense for there to be occasional glitches. Philip K. Dick is one of the most influential science fiction writers of all time. Check out the Philip K. Dick episode where I read this amazing speech where he experienced being in the simulation and the simulation being corrected. Philip K. Dick is a famous science fiction writer, which may undermine his credibility, but the way he spoke about it seemed profoundly authentic. And we've seen many of his ideas on screen, like Total Recall and the Adjustment Bureau and The Man in the High Castle. And he stated in that speech, we are living in a computer-programmed reality. And the only clue that we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. Philip K. Dick believed there are many universes and sometimes those other realities bleed into ours. He claimed to have visions of this and wrote stories like The Man in the High Castle based on these visions, stating that in fact plural realities did exist, superimposed onto one another by so many film transparencies. One way other realities blend into ours could be the Mandela effect. The Mandela effect is when a large number of people have memories of an event that didn't happen. That is called Mandela effect because millions of people specifically remember Nelson Mandela died in prison. People clearly remember his wife walking beside his casket in a funeral procession that was on television for 2 hours that day. This never happened. There's the Berenstain Bears, which people insist were always called the Berenstain Bears. People definitely remember the tycoon in Monopoly having a one-eyed monocle, but he didn't. And then there's the classic Darth Vader line. We all remember Darth Vader saying, "Luke, I am your father." But he didn't say that. There's also Stouffer's stovetop stuffing, which doesn't exist. There's no such product. Stovetop is made by Kraft. The evil queen from Snow White who looked into her mirror and said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall," never said that. She said, "Magic mirror on the wall." I clearly remember her saying, "Mirror, mirror." People remember Febreze being spelled with 2 E's. People remember Jiffy peanut butter, but there's no such thing, and there are a lot more. I most definitely could do a whole entire show just on the Mandela effect. And originally, when I experienced personal Mandela effects on a smaller scale and larger scale, I attributed it to reality shifts, and that could be possible. The program could be running. Some variables could be misinterpreted or run incorrectly, and you, in your consciousness, still remember everything, as Rizwan Virk explained in my interview with him. It is valid in some of these cases that there are intentional false memories, and there are appropriate explanations for some of these false memories. But if the simulation is running through multiple timelines that are being adjusted, then these kind of things become valid proof that we are in a simulation. There's some that still get me. For instance, Flintstones having 2 T's. Or at the end of Moonraker, Jaw's girlfriend doesn't have braces. I clearly remembered those things. I've experienced smaller scale Mandela effects with deaths of people on a regular basis, people that I knew that had died, and then later on I'm checking Facebook and they're not. I would love if you could share some of your experiences. And the more and more I begin to share this stuff in our group, a lot of people are experiencing Mandela effects almost on a regular basis. It cannot all be attributed to false memory. It just simply can't. But this becomes important when millions of people very distinctly remember different things. This is because there's a glitch in the simulation. As Philip K. Dick explained, when there is a glitch in the matrix or we experience one of these Mandela effects, it's because something in our universe has changed and we've branched off into an alternate simulated timeline. You can look to deja vu experiences where you know you've experienced something before, and that could be the simulation updating with new information. Now, obviously, skeptics can easily dismiss these theories that the human mind is terribly unreliable. They don't accept this as evidence. But there is more. There's so much more. We live in a vast universe of trillions and trillions of stars. And even if life is rare, you'd think that there'd be some evidence of it somewhere. This is Fermi's paradox, and according to the Drake equation, there should be over 1 million technologically advanced civilizations just in our galaxy. And on average, there should be a few hundred light years away. But there's nothing, at least not that we can see. So where is everybody? Are we really alone in the universe, or does our program only focus on us? What about the physical rules that are in place? Max Tegmark, a cosmologist at MIT, said the strict laws of physics point to the possibility of a simulation. Putting a cap on the speed of light is a good way to keep you and your Sims from venturing out too far from home. The heretical physicist James Gates thought simulation theory was crazy. Then he started studying quarks and electrons. He found error-correcting code buried deep inside the equations used to describe string theory. Gates says that writ in the fabric of the cosmos, you can find bits of ones and zeros. In 2017, a group of scientists at the University of Washington proved they can embed computer code into strands of DNA. Everything in nature is math. Look at the Fibonacci sequence. You get the Fibonacci sequence by adding two previous numbers in the sequence together. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8, 8 plus 5 equals 13, and so on. With those numbers, you get the golden ratio. When you divide the previous ones, you get 1.618. And so you see this everywhere in nature, everywhere. The number of petals on a flower is usually a Fibonacci number. Lilies have 3 petals, buttercups have 5, chicory has 21, and a daisy has 34. And the spacing of each petal is arranged in a circle according to the golden ratio. As trees grow, the number of branches they form is a Fibonacci number. And not just plants, animals too. The ratio of female to male honeybees in a colony is the golden ratio, 1.618. The human body conforms to the golden ratio too. Most of the body follows the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5. 1 nose, 2 eyes, 3 limb segments, 5 fingers, 5 toes, the proportions of the body, the length of your shoulder to your elbow, and from your elbow to your fingertips. That's the golden ratio. Even a DNA molecule measures 34 angstroms long by 21 angstroms wide. Fibonacci numbers and the golden ratio from the spiral of seashells to the spiral of a galaxy and everything in between. Fibonacci numbers are everywhere. Now, some claim this is a coincidence, that humans look for patterns in chaos because that's what we're programmed to do. By trying to debunk simulation theory, they're actually proving it. No matter what we study, whether it's something the size of a galaxy or as small as an electron, everything in the universe seems to follow patterns and rules. In other words, a program. Now, if you were going to simulate an entire universe, you would probably need more advanced technology than what we currently have. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. Moore's law says that computing power doubles every 18 months, and that has held true for about 50 years. Now that is slowing down a little bit, but only because of physical limitations, assuming we can learn to make microchips smaller, and there's no doubt that we will. It's predicted that artificial intelligence could surpass human intelligence within the next 100 years. As Elon Musk points out, when he was a kid, the world's most advanced video game was Pong, 2 rectangles on a screen. 40 years later, the video game technology is so amazing, barely distinguishable from reality. 6 years ago, he said that, and even in that short period of time, software engines have become more and more realistic. If you check out Unreal Engine 5, it is unbelievably accurate, carrying physics and laws to real environments. Imagine what games are going to look like in 6 years or 60 or 6,000 years. But simulating an entire universe, how big of a computer would we need? It's estimated there are 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe. That's a lot of zeros. But that's a lot. If each particle needs 128 bits to calculate its position and momentum, you're at 10 to the power of 83 bits. And that's just for the data storage. We also need computing power to track what each of those particles is doing. If we say 2 floating point operations or flops per second, we're at 2 times 10 to the 80th power flops. There aren't even words for these numbers, and this is the computer power for just the stuff in the universe. What about human intelligence? The human brain can perform 100 trillion calculations per second, or 100 teraflops multiplied by billions of people. The numbers are ridiculous to power all of this simulation. We would need multiple Dyson spheres, the megastructures that capture all of the energy of a star, or we'd have to harness the energy from black holes. That's why many physicists like Michio Kaku say that simulation theory is scientifically impossible. The only computer capable of simulating a universe is the universe itself. And that is one very good argument that makes sense at first glance. But that is not how simulations work. When you're playing a 3D game, the entire game world is not rendered. Instead, the game engine only calculates what the player can see and interact with at that specific moment. If we were living in a simulation, wouldn't it make sense that the creators of the simulation would use a similar technique? So only the portion of the universe that you are actively aware of is activated. If you're playing a video game and there's a car or a building a mile away, that entire object isn't rendered. The game engine only renders the bare minimum of information to make the object look real. A distant building is rendered as just a few pixels, not that complicated. As you get closer, the engine renders more details, but still, it's just a facade. The engine doesn't bother calculating what's inside the building until you actually go into the building. And the reality that we're in works very much the same way. We can test this using the double-slit experiment. If we fire particles in a straight line at a screen, after passing through a single slit, we would expect to see this clumping pattern on the screen of a single line. If we try this with a wave, we expect to see a pattern that's clumped in a wave across the screen. When we add a second slit, it gets very interesting. The waves pass through the double slit. Each slit creates its own wave. When those waves intersect, they cancel each other out. It creates a pattern, which is an interference pattern. So particles passing through 2 slits create clumping patterns. Waves create an interference pattern. If we fire electrons through the slit, we see a clumping pattern as expected. An electron has mass, so it's a tiny bit of matter. If we fire electrons through 2 slits, we should see 2 clumps, but we don't. We see the wave interference pattern. It's not expected. For years, scientists assumed that electrons were colliding with each other, causing the wave pattern. But in the 60s, the experiment was modified so that only 1 electron at a time was fired through the slits. There was no way the electrons could interact with each other, yet we still see an interference pattern. Scientists wanted to see what was causing this, so they added a detector to observe electrons as they passed through the slits. That's when things go from weird to paranormal. As soon as the detectors were installed, the interference pattern went away and the clumping pattern returned. Take the detectors away and the wave interference pattern is back. I even read that they put the camera to observe the electron in there and then unplugged it, and it created the wave pattern. So the atoms knew that it wasn't plugged in. It's as if the particles are aware they're being observed. Physicist John Wheeler had an idea he called the delayed choice experiment. He took photons projected through the double slit, but the detector is not activated until after they pass through the slit, but before they impact the screen. Photons were emitted as waves, passed through the slits as waves, but when the waves were observed before hitting the screen, they suddenly behave like particles again. Obviously, there's an intelligence at work. Wheeler's experiment showed that even though electrons started as waves but behaved like particles after being observed, at the moment the decision to observe them was made, the electrons recorded themselves as having passed through the slits as particles. The electrons changed their state by going back in time. Now, I know that all sounded confusing, but does that not indicate that we are existing within a pretty good quality simulation down to the quantum level? Now, another interesting aspect of this is if they took natural light, like light from another galaxy, millions of light years away, and they project it through the double slit, it creates wave interference patterns. But if we push those photons through a measuring apparatus to observe them, the wave again collapses all the way back to its source. Retrocausality. So simply by choosing to observe the photons, they reach back through time 100 million years and alter their state on the other side of the galaxy. So like a video game engine, it only does this if you're looking. Even though we look out into the universe and we see all these galaxies, they may not actually be there. If we're living in a simulation, then stars and galaxies would simply be projections, and only when we get close with those projections would they become more detailed. This is a great way to save computational resources, and the hard limit of the speed of light makes it impossible for us to get to far off places. Limiting the speed of light is a useful rule to have in place. Quantum mechanics like the double slit experiment and quantum entanglement only make sense if there's a program at work, because only the program can ignore the laws of physics and ignore the concept of time itself. Now, of course, you know this concept of living in a simulation from movies like The Matrix, in which this idea has been explored and has become a generally accepted part of our culture. A convenient case for simulation theory is that you can't disprove it. The Big Bang was simply the simulation booting up. We haven't found any aliens. That's because they're not a part of the simulation. How come UFOs seem to violate the laws of physics? Well, because they're programs operated by the simulation creators, and they don't have to follow the laws of physics. So the question is, who created the simulation? Obviously, that is the big question. What is the simulation and why are we in it? If you think of the simulation creator as an omniscient intelligence who exists outside of our understanding of space and time, it sounds an awful lot like we're talking about God. So it's not denying that God exists. So it works just like the simulation. You can't prove that we're not in a simulation, and you can't prove that there is no God. One common question is, why would they create a simulation? Are there non-player characters? Are the characters that are involved in the simulation in it for a purpose? Or are we used to determine something statistically about something else? They run the simulation to find out if war is going to happen. I do think that simulations would be created for entertainment purposes. A sufficiently advanced civilization capable of running simulations would likely have only one existential risk: having mastered science, and that's being an alien civilization. Therefore, they would be inclined to run simulations of civilizations alien to their own and pre-singularity in order to better understand how beings with different origins than their own would operate after achieving singularity or obtaining the keys to the universe. The data obtained by running simulations similar to our reality would thus be invaluable and would warrant them running so many of them simultaneously that we could say our reality is probably one of these alien ancestor simulations. This could also be a soul school for new beings. Instead of letting themselves fall into a trap of taking their amazing technology for granted, never knowing adversity or disparity and falling into uncaring, spoiled decadence, perhaps they run simulations that approximate their pre-singularity civilization so that prospective denizens of their civilization can learn valuable personal lessons and grow from small origins instead of being thrust into existence as godlike beings. Oftentimes I find that the lessons in my own life tend to be lessons in becoming God or using power, using love. Those are my own ideas of what might be happening. One thing that's fascinating is that many believers of simulation theory are atheists. On the other hand, I have found this to be a very spiritual realization. Just allows me to understand through this hypothesis of the ways in which reality acts. The idea that the world around us isn't the real world is not a new one. It goes back to the foundational texts of Hinduism, the Vedas, which were composed in India 5,000 years ago. In fact, this idea that the world around us isn't the real world permeates all of the world's major religions in some form or another. Not to be outdone, philosophers, both ancient and modern, have gotten into the act. After all, sitting around and wondering about the nature of reality isn't limited to either mystics exploring ecstatic states in the Himalayas or college students in late-night dorm discussions. Philosophers seem to occupy an interesting middle ground between scientists and mystics, asking some of the big questions. One of the earliest philosophers to write about this idea was Plato, whose allegory of the cave appears in the Republic. In it, Plato, through his mentor and literary alter ego Socrates, explains that most of us are prisoners inside a cave, chained to a wall in such a way that we can only see the wall opposite the opening of the cave. Outside the cave is a fire or light which projects shadows onto the wall, like an ancient version of puppet theater. Since the people in the cave have only ever seen the shadows on the wall, that is all they know, believing that the interplay of shadows is reality. Plato argues that philosophers are metaphorically able to break the chains and escape this cave to see outside. Anyone who does this will at first naturally be blinded by the light. Remember, they've spent their entire life in a dark cave, but their eyes will eventually adjust. When they do, the unchained philosopher will see what seems like wondrous things. The philosopher will want to return and tell the people inside the cave what reality is really like, but of course, the people in the cave, not knowing any better, will balk at this idea, not willing to give up their familiar life of being chained inside the cave. Within this simulation, we only have 5 senses. And so I fall upon that most of the time. We have a limited field of senses. We can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can taste, we can touch. Imagine having a body with 1,000 senses. You have limited senses while in this simulation. And so that's what this simulation is designed around, having a body and being limited to these 5 senses. If you understand the way the computers work, and you understand that you can run a simulation in a matter of seconds, over and over and over again, then while we're experiencing it, it appears that time is moving at its normal flow in time, but at the same time, we are experiencing universes over and over and over again. This helps us to understand how time is collapsed within a simulation. There's some great places that you can find a discussion of simulations and multiverse theory as well. I find this difficult to talk about because there's so many different aspects to it. I would love to get your discussion. Do we exist within a simulation? Is the simulation scripted or is it a game? Are there non-player characters? What does it mean if we are in a simulation? And should we worry about it? These are questions that are ongoing, and each of us must answer for ourselves. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and welcome to The Reality Revolution.